It's June 1948, inside the White House. A grand piano stands in a second-floor sitting room, directly above the family dining room, and the instrument belongs to Margaret Truman, the president's only child. Then a leg of that piano punches straight through the floor. When the engineers open the room up, they find the thing nobody wanted to say out loud. The main beam under the floor has split completely through. The ceiling below has sagged a full 18 inches. The whole west end of the second story is sinking into the building. Within months, a hand-picked team of the country's best architects will rule the most powerful house on earth unsafe to live in, and they will move the president out of it. Here is the part that should stop you. This was not the first time the White House had been stripped to a bare stone shell and built back from the inside. The British had already done it once, by burning it in 1814. And the house you picture today is not even the original. It is closer to the fifth version of itself, wrapped over and over in the same old walls. To understand how the People's House ended up one rotten beam away from collapse, we have to go back 156 years, to a mosquito-ridden swamp on the Potomac, and to the people who raised it with their hands, most of them in chains. This is the story of the muscle, the machines, and the human cost that built the White House. Not the presidents who slept in it, the house itself. We spent weeks pulling this together, so stay with us, because we are going to walk it up from the mud in 7 phases, from the first stone to the day a bulldozer rolled through the front rooms. Start in the year 1790. The country is new, broke, and arguing about where to put its capital. The deal that finally settles it, written into the Residence Act, hands the choice of the exact site to George Washington, and he picks a stretch of low, wet ground where the Potomac meets the Anacostia, land ceded by 2 states that both permitted slavery, Virginia and Maryland. Remember that detail. It quietly decides who is going to do the work. The new city is laid out in 1791 and named after him, and it is barely a city at all, just fields, forest, and marsh. To design the president's house, the commissioners hold a public contest in 1792. 9 entries come in, including one submitted in secret under a set of initials by Thomas Jefferson himself. The winner is an Irish immigrant named James Hoban, born to a modest family in County Kilkenny, trained at a drawing school in Dublin, and working out of Charleston, South Carolina. His prize is $500 and a city lot. His design leans on Leinster House in Dublin, and Washington asks him to enlarge it by about a fifth, because the first version is not grand enough for the statement they are trying to make to the world. On October 13th, 1792, a group of Freemasons lays the cornerstone in a public ceremony, led by a local master mason and Georgetown official named Pedro Casanave. The commissioners staged that ceremony on purpose to pull a crowd and sell plots of land, because they needed the cash to pay the workforce and buy the supplies. And here is a small mystery that has never been solved. Masons normally set a cornerstone in the northeast corner of a building, but a letter surfaced later placing this one in the southwest. Nobody has ever found it. The single most symbolic stone in the entire structure has been lost for more than 2 centuries, somewhere under the walls. Now the commissioners hit their first real wall, and it is a labor problem. The plan looked simple on paper. Bring in skilled European stonemasons and craftsmen, pay them a wage, and put up the building. They even placed advertisements in newspapers, at home and abroad, calling for workers. But the recruiting goes nowhere. Europe is not sending anywhere near enough men to a raw construction camp in a Virginia swamp. So the commissioners make a decision, and it is a deliberate one, not some accident of the era. They turn to African Americans, both enslaved and free, but primarily enslaved, to supply the bulk of the labor that will raise the White House, the Capitol, and most of the early government buildings around them. This is not a rumor, and it is not a slogan. The National Archives holds the paperwork itself. Wage rolls, promissory notes, and vouchers, all documenting the work, some of it put on public display years ago under a plain title: that slaves built the White House and the Capitol. As early as 1791, the city's own planner, Pierre L'Enfant, was already leasing enslaved people from their owners just to clear the ground where the house would stand. The government itself did not own these people. It rented them by the month, and the money went to the men who owned them, not to the men who did the work. Walk down to the quarry, because that is where the house physically begins. The stone is soft, porous sandstone, cut from the government's own quarry at Aquia Creek in Virginia, on a piece of ground they called Government Island. It is easy to carve, which is why they chose it, and it is brutally heavy to move, which is the problem. Each finished block has to be quarried out by hand, rough-shaped on the island, muscled onto a boat, floated miles up the Potomac, unloaded, and then lifted into place on a rising wall, over and over, thousands of times. A Scottish master mason named Colin Williamson runs the stonework, and he trains enslaved laborers right there on the island to quarry and rough-cut the blocks. Those blocks are floated up the river by boat, then dressed and set by the Scottish masons to raise the walls. Enslaved people are woven into every stage of it. They swing the axes to fell the timber. They stand in the saw pits as sawyers, cutting logs into boards. They fire the kilns and mold the bricks for the interior walls. They haul, they dig, they lift. The conditions in the work camp are rough on everyone, but the enslaved workers have no wage, no choice, and no way home at the end of the day. Alongside them, labor-free black men who are actually paid for the same work, and the contrast sits right there in the ledgers. Historians who have gone deep into this, including the journalist Jesse Holland, note that for most of American history, this workforce was simply written out of the story altogether. And a few of them are skilled craftsmen, working shoulder to shoulder with the Europeans. We know 4 of their names for certain, because those names appear on a single carpenter's payroll from May of 1795. Peter, Ben, Harry, Daniel. Their wages were signed for by their owner, and their owner was Hoban, the architect himself. In that 1 month, Peter and Ben each worked 28 days. On the ledger, Peter's labor is valued at £10 and 10 shillings, Ben's at £8 and 8 shillings, Daniel's at £6 and 5 shillings, Harry's at £2 and 5 shillings. Real numbers for real men, whose pay was collected by somebody else. Look closely at those old rosters, and you find something colder than the labor itself. Next to the enslaved names, the clerks wrote a single letter, N for Negro. It was a bookkeeping mark, a way to sort human beings the way you would sort lumber and lime. The White House Historical Association has spent years reassembling these records, and they have now linked more than 300 enslaved individuals to building and staffing the house. Over 200 known enslaved people worked on the White House and the Capitol together, with more than 100 more on other buildings nearby. Many of the names survive only as fragments, written as a single first name and the name of an owner, because that is all the paperwork bothered to keep. There is even a contemporary drawing of a slave coffle, a line of chained people being marched right past the Capitol grounds while the government buildings went up. And this is the fact that a lot of the videos about this house rush past in one soft sentence, so let us not rush it. A future First Lady, Michelle Obama, said it plainly from a national stage in 2016. She said she wakes up every morning in a house that was built by slaves. When she said it, thousands of people flooded the historians with calls, refusing to believe it was true. The historians pulled the payrolls and confirmed every word. The monument to a free republic was raised, in large part, by people who owned nothing at all, not even themselves. By the late 1790s, the walls are up, and the crews face a practical problem with that soft aquea stone. It drinks water. Left alone, rain soaks into the porous surface, freezes solid in the Washington winter, and cracks the stone apart from the inside. So in 1798, the workers coat the whole exterior in a lime-based whitewash to seal it. That is the real reason the house is white. Not paint, not glory, not a fire. A cheap protective coating brushed onto thirsty stone. Hold on to that, because in a few minutes we are going to watch the most famous myth about this entire building fall apart on exactly this point. The interior, meanwhile, goes up fast and rough. The skeleton inside those grand stone walls is timber. All of it. Because timber is quick. And quick is what everyone wants. Because they are already years behind schedule, and the first president is supposed to move in. He does, but only barely. On November 1st, 1800, John Adams becomes the first president to occupy the house, and it is nowhere near finished. Out of 36 rooms, only about 6 are livable. The plaster is still wet. The grand staircase does not even exist yet. And there is no running water anywhere in the building, so every single drop is carried in by hand, one bucket at a time, from a spring outside on the grounds. There is no proper road to the place, just mud. The grounds are a churned-up construction yard, littered with workers' shacks, stone chips, and the leftover kilns that burned oyster shells into lime for the mortar. His wife, Abigail Adams, hangs the family laundry to dry in the Great East Room, the same room where presidents now host kings and sign treaties, because at that point, it is nothing but an empty, unfinished cavern. She also writes a line about the house that was later carved into the mantel in the state dining room, a prayer that none but honest and wise men would ever rule under its roof. And Washington, the man who chose the site and drove the entire project forward, never spent a single night inside it. He was already dead by the time it opened. When Jefferson arrives in 1801, he starts adding the things a working house actually needs. He builds long, low colonnades to hide the messy service work, the ice, the meat, the coal, and the wine. And he installs some of the very first water closets, an early indoor toilet fed by a cistern up in the attic. The house is slowly turning into a machine for living. And then, just 14 years after it opens, someone burns it to the ground. It's August 24th, 1814. The country is at war with Britain again, and it is losing badly. This particular attack is revenge. A year earlier, American troops had burned public buildings in York, the town that is now Toronto, and the British have come to return the favor on the capital. That morning, the American militia is routed at Bladensburg, just outside the city, and the road into Washington is left wide open. A British force under Major General Robert Ross, alongside the aggressive Rear Admiral George Cockburn, marches straight into the Capitol with orders to burn the public buildings. President James Madison is already gone, out in the field with his generals. His wife, Dolly, is still in the house, and this is the moment where one of the most repeated stories in American history has to be told correctly, because the popular version is wrong. You have heard that Dolly single-handedly cut a giant portrait of Washington down from the wall and carried it out as the redcoats closed in. That is not quite what happened. The full-length Gilbert Stuart portrait of Washington was screwed to the dining room wall and stood a full 8 feet tall. The First Lady refused to leave without it, and she gave the order to save it. But the screws were far too slow for the moment, so on her command, the frame itself was smashed apart, and the canvas was cut out of it by other hands. The house steward, a Frenchman named Jean-Pierre Siussat, and a gardener did the actual work. And watching all of it happen was a 15-year-old enslaved footman owned by the Madisons, a boy named Paul Jennings. Decades later, after he had bought his own freedom, Jennings wrote a memoir, and in it he pushed back hard on the legend, insisting that the stories crediting the First Lady alone with the rescue were simply not true. Two men from New York then carried the canvas away and hid it in a farmhouse outside the city. And here is one more twist the myth always leaves out. The painting they risked everything to save was not even the original. It was a copy. Then the British walk in, and they take their time. They sit down and eat the dinner that was still laid out on the table for dozens of guests. They toast their king with the president's own wine, and only then do they set the house on fire. That soft stone shell, packed full of Hoban's dry timber skeleton, turns into a furnace. The heat grows so intense that the sandstone itself begins to crack and blacken. By the next morning, everything inside is gone. Only the scorched outer walls are still standing, blackened and smoking. And then the storm does something that almost sounds invented. On August 25th, a severe storm, with real evidence from the Weather Service of a tornado touching down in the middle of the city, roars through Washington. The torrential rain smothers the last of the fires, and the wind and the chaos help drive the British back out of the capital. It even helped that the very next day, a stray accident with gunpowder barrels killed about 30 of their own soldiers. Nature and bad luck put out the fire that an army had started. The house had lived one full life, and it was already a blackened ruin. Madison and the American forces came back to a gutted, humiliated capital, staring up at the smoke-stained walls of the president's own home. The most powerful symbol the young country had was a burned-out husk, and the enemy had eaten dinner in it first. If you are the kind of person who would rather have the real version than the myth, this is your channel. We build one of these every single week, machine by machine, with the human cost left in and the legends checked against the record. Go ahead and subscribe now so the next one finds you. Now, back to the ashes, because the country decides to rebuild. There is a real argument about just walking away. Some want to move the capital somewhere safer, away from British warships, maybe inland to the west. But the decision holds. If the young republic is going to survive, this house has to rise again on the very same spot. So they bring back the one man who knows it best, Hoban, older now, to rebuild his own ruin. And here the story plants the seed of its own future disaster. To finish fast, Hoban rebuilds the interior the same way he built it the first time, with timber framing instead of solid masonry. He traps a forest of wood inside a box of stone, all over again. That single choice gets the house standing quickly, which is what everyone needs. It also guarantees that a century later, that hidden wooden skeleton will rot, sag, and nearly bring the whole thing down on a first family. The reconstruction gets far enough along that James Monroe moves back in during 1817, and the walls get their fresh coat of whitewash to hide the burn scars underneath. Which brings us to the single biggest myth about this building, and we can finally take it apart with the record in hand. The story everyone repeats is that the house was painted white for the first time to hide the scorch marks left by the fire, and that this is exactly how it got the name the White House. It is a great story. It is also completely false, and the people who actually guard the house say so directly. The building was already white. It had been whitewashed since 1798, 16 years before the British ever arrived, purely to protect that porous stone from freezing. And the name was already in use before the war. 3 months before the fighting even started, in March of 1812, a congressman named Abijah Bigelow wrote a letter that used the phrase "without a second thought." "There is much trouble at the White House," he wrote, "as we call it. I mean the president's. People were calling it the White House before the fire, for the simple reason that it was a house that was white. In 1818, the exterior was finally coated in longer-lasting white lead paint, and the nickname slowly spread, though for decades many people still called it the President's House or the Executive Mansion. It did not become the building's official name until October of 1901, when Theodore Roosevelt had the words White House printed on his stationery and made it real. The fire did not name this house. A cheap coat of lime did, more than a decade earlier. For the record, keeping it that color today takes around 570 gallons of white paint. Over the next few years, the exterior finally gets the features we all recognize. The famous curved south porch, the semicircular south portico, goes up in the 1820s, and the columned north portico that ends up on every photograph and postcard is added at the end of that same decade. On the outside, the house we picture in our head sheets is basically complete. On the inside, the clock on that timber skeleton has already started ticking. Now comes the long, slow middle of the story. Roughly a century of the house being patched, wired, and modernized on top of a frame that was never built to last. And here is the quiet trap in all of it. Every single upgrade makes the house more capable, and every single upgrade also makes the structure heavier and more strained. The plumbing comes first. Running water is finally piped into the building in the 1830s, so the endless buckets stop. Gas lighting arrives in the 1840s, replacing candles and whale oil, though the fumes and the smell bring their own misery. Then, in 1891, comes the strangest upgrade of them all: electricity. The wiring is installed during the presidency of Benjamin Harrison, and it terrifies the family. Harrison and his wife are so afraid of being shocked that they refuse to touch the light switches themselves. They would rather leave the lights burning all night and wait for a staff member to shut them off in the morning than risk putting a finger on the switch. A house lit by a technology its own residents are too scared to operate. That is roughly the state of the building at the end of the 1800s. It is crammed with new systems and swelling with staff, and the work of running a growing country is quietly strangling the home inside the walls. The man who finally does something drastic is Roosevelt himself, in 1902. He has a large, loud family and an expanding government jammed into the same set of rooms, and it simply does not work anymore. So he orders the biggest change the House has seen since the fire. He moves the government offices out of the residence entirely, into a brand new structure off to the west, a building that was only ever meant to be temporary. That temporary building is the West Wing, and it is still there more than a century later, having survived a serious fire of its own on Christmas Eve of 1929. Roosevelt's renovation is also the moment the name is locked in, and the house starts being treated, for the first time, as a national museum as much as a family home. A few years later, the president's working office is built as an oval room, the first real Oval Office, and it is later rebuilt in its current form and location under a different administration in the 1930s. But every one of these additions is still resting on the same aging bones. In 1927, under Calvin Coolidge, the old attic is torn off and rebuilt as a true third floor, adding a whole level of new rooms, and with them a whole new load of dead weight pressing down on Hoban's 100-year-old timber. Then the modern age and the wars pile on even more. Franklin Roosevelt has an indoor swimming pool built in 1933, partly as therapy for his polio. And when the Second World War arrives, the house has to become a fortress. A new east wing goes up in 1942, and its real secret job is to hide something being dug in underneath it. Beneath that wing, crews excavate a bunker, a bomb-resistant shelter that becomes the underground command center presidents still fall back to in a genuine crisis. He also converts a ground-floor room into a map room, the nerve center where he follows the war, and that hidden shelter below is later formalized into what is now known as the Presidential Emergency Operations Center. Every year, the house is asked to do more and carry more. And every single year, unseen behind the plaster and the paint, the wooden frame from 1815 is quietly giving up. Which brings us right back to where we started, to the piano and the broken beam, and to the full, grim verdict that finally followed. By the mid-1940s, the staff had already lived with the warning signs for years. Floors that heaved and swayed underfoot, chandeliers that swung on their own, strange cracking and groaning sounds inside the walls at night. An Army engineering report back in 1941 had actually flagged the failing structure and the fire hazard, and it was simply dismissed. When Harry Truman moves in 1945, one well-known story has him sitting in his second-floor bathtub and feeling the entire floor begin to sink beneath the weight of the water, as if the tub might drop straight through the ceiling into a formal party in the room below. Then his daughter's piano leg goes through the floor in 1948, and that is finally the end of pretending. A formal engineering survey is ordered, and the findings are worse than anyone had feared. The main second-floor beam is split completely through. The load-bearing walls are crumbling. The ceiling of the east room is sagging 6 inches. The plumbing is written up as makeshift and unsanitary. One engineer famously reports that parts of the structure are standing up purely out of habit. The house is not just tired. It is in active danger of falling down while people are living inside it. So in November of 1948, the Trumans move out, across the street to Blair House, where a little later, Truman survives a real assassination attempt while the work grinds on behind him. On November 1st, 1950, 2 men storm Blair House trying to kill him, and a White House policeman is killed stopping them. All while, across the street, the president's real house sits as a gutted crater behind a thin stone mask. And the country faces a genuine choice. A congressional commission seriously debates whether to simply bulldoze the entire thing and put up a brand new mansion from scratch, because that would honestly be cheaper. Truman testifies against it. He tells Congress that tearing it down might be cheaper on paper, but that it would destroy a building of enormous historical meaning in the growth of the nation. He wins the argument. They will save the house. But saving it, it turns out, means something almost violent. What follows, from December of 1949 to March of 1952, is the most extreme thing that has ever been done to the People's House, and it is finally the machine story this channel lives for. They gut it. Everything inside the exterior stone walls comes out. Every floor, every interior wall, the grand staircase, all of it, torn away until the building is a hollow shell of its original outer skin, held up from the inside by a temporary web of steel shoring so the historic facade does not collapse straight into the pit. Picture that for a second. A thin, hollow ring of 200-year-old sandstone standing on its own, braced by a cage of fresh steel, with a deep hole opening up in the ground inside it. Some of the interior is cataloged and numbered on the way out, in the hope of putting a little of it back later. Most of it never came back. A formal commission on the renovation of the Executive Mansion runs the project, with an architect named Lorenzo Winslow drawing the new house. And the general contractor is a man named John McShane, already known as the Builder of Washington, the same firm that had just finished the Pentagon and the Jefferson Memorial. His crews haul the debris out by the truckload, through openings cut low into the exterior walls, load after load in wheelbarrows. Some of the salvageable old material is carted off to a millwork firm to be reworked. And then they do the thing that the old black and white photographs make almost impossible to believe. They drive earth-moving equipment inside the shell. A small bulldozer works down in the open pit where the staterooms used to stand, digging out new, far deeper foundations that finally reach solid ground. Inside those preserved outer walls, they erect a completely new skeleton, a steel superstructure one account calls skyscraper strength, set on fresh concrete footings. They dig out not one, but two entirely new basement levels beneath the house, and into that new underground world, they build a labyrinth of modern rooms and systems. And because the calendar has turned, because the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb right as this work began, one of those new levels is fitted out as a top-secret fallout shelter. The rebuild that started as a rescue from rot quietly becomes, halfway through, a Cold War bunker. The whole undertaking costs about $5.7 million, roughly double the original repair estimate, driven up by the wartime economy and all that secret underground work. In March of 1952, after 3.5 years camped across the street, the Trumans move back into a house that looks, from Pennsylvania Avenue, exactly the way it always had, and that is, on the inside, a completely new building. The old stone face, wrapped around a modern steel body. It is honest to call it a demolition that carefully kept its own portrait. And it was not clean, and it was not perfect. To hit the budget and the schedule, an enormous amount of the original interior, old woodwork, plaster, and hand-finished material, was ripped out and either thrown away or sold off, some of it chopped up into souvenirs. Preservationists still argue, to this day, that the rescue destroyed a great deal of the very thing it was supposed to be saving. The house that stands there now is in its actual bones the house that Truman's crews built inside Hoban's old walls. So how many times was the White House really built? Count them. Raised the first time by enslaved and immigrant hands straight out of the swamp. Burned to a hollow shell and rebuilt after 1814. Torn open and reframed at the start of the 20th century, then piled higher under Coolidge. And finally gutted down to nothing and rebuilt inside its own skin under Truman. The building you picture the instant someone says the White House is not one house. It is at least the fifth version of a single idea, wrapped over and over in the same 18th century stone. And that stone still tells the truth, if you know where to look. When the exterior was cleaned and fully restored across the years between the Carter and the Clinton administrations, the workers uncovered the actual scorch marks from 1814, still burned into the sandstone, and they made a deliberate choice to leave them exposed rather than paint back over them, so that the fire would never be forgotten. The house wears its own scars on purpose. Think about what that actually means. The most photographed home on the planet is, up close, a patched, burned, and rebuilt survivor, wearing a fresh coat of white over 2 centuries of damage and repair. And in just the last few years, out on the grounds around it, new markers have finally been raised, carrying the names that the old payrolls once tried to erase down to a single cold letter. Peter, Ben, Harry, Daniel, and the hundreds more, half-remembered, who quarried the stone, fired the brick, and raised the walls of a house built to stand for a freedom that was never once extended to them. That is the real story of how the White House was built. Not a single time, and never by the men whose names ended up on the doors. If you want the next one, the real machines that built another impossible place, With the myth stripped clean off and the human cost left in, subscribe, and we will see you there.